It's been 34 years. You've had 66 human body recoveries, over 800 search and rescue mission days, and a cumulative 2.5 years away from your family, all spent with volunteered time for the benefit of strangers. Why do you keep going back?
Well, I suppose that goes way back in my life, but it was compelled by just wanting to make a difference. It started with a little girl that disappeared in Joshua Tree in 1984, a little 3.5-year-old girl named Laura Bradbury. And when a family loses a child like that, um, it hurt. It hurt. And so I just felt like I needed to do something, and I knew that area really well. And I just went down and volunteered, and I got hooked. And I kept doing it because, to be honest, Kyle, it felt like a calling on my life. I felt like God had gifted me with certain skill sets in the backcountry. Started with climbing in 1975, and as a 13-year-old, and I like to say I've learned how to suffer well. And a lot of search and rescue is just that, because it's rare that events happen when the weather's nice. It seems, at least in my career, that the weather was a cause of a lot of the incidents that I responded to. So, yeah, I just think you want to. It was an answer to a calling for me, and you want to help people. You have these skill sets, and it's hard to say no. So I just made a commitment that when the sheriff called, I wouldn't say no.
It sounds like you had a sense of duty in a way.
Well, yeah. And, I've had experiences over the course of both my climbing career and my SAR career where I was, nearly a victim myself. And so I know that feeling of being desperate and, being on the edge and really needing help. And so with that mindset, that was kind of a driver in me,
Mm-hmm.
a motivator, I guess, to get out there and just try and make a difference.
Now, you had mentioned a girl that had gone missing, and that kind of being the catalyst for your journey into SAR.
Yeah.
Um, I guess talk to us a little bit more about kind of that story, but also how, your path as a climber and that catalyst into SAR kind of crossed.
Sure. Yeah. Well, I started climbing in Joshua Tree in 1975 as a 13-year-old. And so, over the years, all through high school, climbing through high school, I really got to learn the park well. We called it the monument back then.
You called Joshua Tree the monument?
Yeah, it wasn't a national park back then. It was Joshua Tree National Monument.
Mm-hmm.
So, anyway, Laura Bradbury's family came out and were camping at Indian Cove Campground. And she and her little brother went to, and Laura was 3.5, but she and her little brother, who was slightly older, went to use one of the pit toilets there in the campground. And her brother stepped in and, did his thing. And when he came out, Laura was gone. And so that was the start. And, I was living nearby. I was living in the San Bernardino Mountains, so fairly close by. And I heard the news, and I felt really compelled to go down there and make some effort. So I went to the SAR base that the sheriff had set up there at the Indian Cove campground and said, hey, put me to work. I know this area well. I've climbed here now for, at that point, 9 years. And so I just dove in, and, the search went on initially for a couple of weeks, and hit a lot of dead ends, but I just stayed committed to it, and I lived close by. So over the course of the next 2.5 years, I spent 162 days out there on my own, just searching for any kind of evidence. And after 2.5 years, some skeletal remains were found that ultimately were proved to be Laura's. DNA testing and stuff a lot of that was non-existent back then. So
Mm.
but eventually those remains were proved to be Laura's, and but all those days out there just lit a fire in me, and even though I came up empty, as far as my efforts, I knew that I was doing something significant for that family, just helping, because I mean, I'm a father now and a grandfather, and I wasn't then, but I was raised in a strong family, and I could only imagine what that couple, and seeing them out there, Laura's parents, with the anguish on their face, it was a hard thing.
Was that the first time a real deep sense of empathy struck you as a young adult?
Well, I don't know if it was the first time. I mean, there were certainly instances throughout my childhood where I witnessed tragedy, and some of it stuff that kids shouldn't really have to see. Witnessed a few deaths up in Yosemite, and
At what age?
I think the first one, a guy took a fall about an 80-footer at the base of Bridalveil Falls. I think I was maybe 10 years old.
And were you climbing at this time?
I wasn't, but I was there with a church youth group, and we had hiked up to the base of the falls, and I was weaving around the boulders there, and came around the corner, and there was a guy trying to help this absolutely shattered body that was laying in about 8 inches of water, and just blood everywhere. And the guy that was trying to render assistance, said, "Go get," just screamed, "Go get help." And so me and another friend that was with me, we just took off running and ran all the way down the trail to the parking lot and alerted the rangers. And unfortunately, that subject did not survive. But yeah, I think empathy. Growing up in a Christian home, we were raised that way. That when someone was hurting, you did what you could to help out.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
So you were exposed to death at a very young age in a very real way.
Yeah, the earliest was in the 6th grade, and I mentioned this in my book that a young friend, I think 6th grade must be about 10 years old, maybe 11 years old, and he was cleaning his bicycle in his garage with some gasoline, and there was a water heater in the garage, and the fumes lit from the pilot light and lit him on fire, and he took off running out of the garage, and a neighbor saw him running on fire literally across yards and stuff, and screaming. And at any rate, he ended up in the hospital and had sucked in a bunch of flames into his lungs, and ended up with really bad double pneumonia and scarred lungs, and died in the hospital about 5 days later. And then my mom took me to his funeral. So seeing your 6th grade classmate in a casket is it's a real eye opener,
Yeah. What did I would say that's a pretty uncommon thing for such a young human to go through. What effect did that have on you at such a young age?
And I mentioned this in my book as well. I pushed the boundaries when I was a kid. I was the black sheep of the family, so I was always going against the grain, and life was different back then. I mean, kind of the rule was we just had to be home when the street lights came on, and I'd end up miles and miles away from home, and my parents never knew. But seeing that young friend's death, or experiencing that, it really made me. It gave me thought, even at that young age, 11 years old, that there's consequences to some of the things that we do, and whether it tempered my zeal for adventure, maybe for a short time, but it definitely gave me pause, and it was traumatic. And I mean, it was traumatic enough that now at 63 years old, I can remember every piece of that, including that funeral, like it was yesterday. So
I think, I resonate with you in terms of being someone that kind of pushes the boundaries. I like to say I like to find the edge until where the universe pushes back. And I think that mentality can get you in a lot of trouble with the law, with your body. Like it's a dangerous pursuit, because the edge is very volatile. Would you say that that particular situation, like, kind of reeled you in just a little bit to the point where, like, okay, I don't need to like put both toes or both, all 10 toes over the edge. I can like look over the edge a little bit, if you understand what I'm saying.
I do, and again, I the best way to answer that is I can definitely recall it tempering me for a time, but then, and this is probably more of a boy thing than a girl thing, but the more you could probably relate to this, the more you get away with, as you're pushing boundaries, you get away with this, and then it just kind of motivates you to, hey,
Well, that you haven't found the edge, right?
yeah, exactly.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. And so at some juncture, fairly early on, probably, I started climbing like a couple years later, and that, my first climb just absolutely lit a fire under me that had to be stoked, So it was like, just throw caution to the wind, and so all of a sudden that tragedy from the few years before gets pushed into the back of your mind, and until the next one comes along. And unfortunately, I've seen a lot.
Yeah. Before I want to dive into your, progression as a climber. But real quick on this topic of kind of pushing the edge. I think you said you had 23 close calls you can count.
Yeah, so I've always been a journaler, and actually started in junior high school, and so I've kept a climbing journal throughout these 50 years of climbing, and then writing reports, for the sheriff's office for every SAR mission. So going back and doing the research of my database to produce the narrative for my book, um, the the evidence was there that
in terms of being able to, we talk about the edge. I think that sometimes we can step all the way over, and I would say, there are two ways we come back over that edge alive, and I'd say one of them is luck, and then the other one I'd say is a bit more spiritual. And we have, like, I speak for myself. I have a late grandfather, my mom's dad. He died from colon cancer when I was about 6 months old, and he really loved hummingbirds. And I'm like one of 14 grandchildren now, and I'm the only one he ever met. And so, like, I attribute a lot of my survival through my countless situations with, surviving death or cheating death, coming back across that edge.
yeah,
With luck, for sure. Luck comes from being prepared, so there's that whole avenue of it. But I also attribute it to, something greater kind of looking out for me.
yeah.
For yourself, kind of where do you stand on, being able to come back across that veil 23 times and not pay the price?
Yeah, and most of those 23 times that I identified through my journaling happened during climbing situations, not so much SAR situations. My closest call was with a SAR situation, but I recount in the book a couple of climbing instances of really close calls. And when I wrote the book, I really wanted to show in those early chapters where I share some of these things from that that occurred in my childhood, that providence, I believe, played a huge role.
What's providence? I've not heard that word.
Providence is a term in relation to God's will for our lives, and people always ask, well, why do some die young and some live to 100? I mean, we all have our days are all numbered, and certainly we can do things that push the limit and maybe shorten our experience, shall we say, on this globe. But no, I just really feel that, and I believe I give good evidence in the book that God's guardian angels have been with me since as early as I can remember, and I always remember to thank Him for that. You come out of these near-death experiences, and I just have to say, Lord, thank you for, giving me another chance. And with every one of those experiences, um, it kind of shapes you. You start looking at your your willingness to take risk. And I was just talking with a friend last night about this, how when my first child was born, 30 it'll be 34 years ago this Saturday. It just really made me consider more the level of risk that I was willing to take, and and just be more cognizant of it, and I think with every close call, it hones us. Hopefully we get wiser. You know, I know I'm a little bit wiser at 63 than I was at 13.
You'd hope
A
so,
little
and
bit.
I think that you really pay the price when you don't learn the first lesson the first time. Like if you're granted the chance to survive after and learn the lesson, if you don't learn the lesson, you're inevitably going to make that mistake again, and you might not get the grace again to
Oh
to
yeah,
survive that lesson twice.
yeah, exactly. And that grace is a great word. Someone asked me recently, how do I explain grace? You know, which I believe comes from God, and I explain it this way: it's like being up on a wall, on a long climb, multi-pitch, hot day, and the sun's just beating down on your back. You're looking up into the sun. You're just getting roasted. Going through lots of chalk, and then a cloud comes over, and all of a sudden you're in the shade, and it's just this instant relief, right? I know you've been there, and that's the way God's grace is, and I feel like when we're not walking in His grace, that's like that cloud's like His hand, shielding us. And then when we're not walking in His grace or not in alignment with Him, that hand just kind of gets pulled back a little bit, just so we feel the heat a little bit. You know what I mean?
Hmm.
And so yeah, I just account the things that the close calls that I've had to God's guardian angels going with me every day, and
Nice.
I still need them every day.
Yeah, I think for someone to survive, all the situations you've been through, I think there's definitely just something else that at play there. And I also feel like, when we survive things like that, at least for myself, I hold myself accountable. It's like, okay, I'm here for a reason.
Yeah,
There's some reason why I'm still alive, and it's my purpose to figure out what that is and what do I have to offer this earth with the grace that I've been given to continue living, even though I came so close.
yeah. There you go.
Yeah.
You know, um, it's that old adage. There's no atheists in foxholes. I mean, when the stuff's hitting the fan, it's like I'm grateful for a higher power. I've climbed myself into plenty of trouble, and I'm really glad for that grace.
Okay, I want to circle back on your kind of progression as a climber.
Yeah.
And maybe just tell the story real quick. It seemed like your parents were very much at odds with your passion for or your interest for climbing, and you kind of sought out education on your own. So yeah, tell us that story.
Yeah. So, I was born actually in Chicago, and then lived most of my early life in rural Missouri, outside of St. Louis. But my family moved to California in 1969, and we started going to Yosemite every summer. And I'd see those climbers up on those walls, and that just fueled a fire in me, right? And this house we were living in, the first house in California, this would have been 1969. There was a family that lived next door, and their son was a climber.
Mhm.
And while we were living there, I think it was maybe a year after we'd moved into that house, he was up in Yosemite climbing. He and two partners, they were doing a first ascent of a route on the Glacier Point apron. And I think they were up at the anchor. They had just put in the anchor at the top of the third pitch, and the anchor failed,
Oh,
and all three of them went to the ground. And so
oh my
this family
gosh.
lost a son. And, here we were going to Yosemite, and my parents heard this story, this climber right next door, this young man died. And ironically, years later, I did get to climb that route. It was finished by another party, and it was kind of sardonic. It was named Anchors Away.
Whoa.
Yeah. But anyway, when I announced to my parents at 13 years old that I wanted to start climbing, they were like, "No, that's not going to happen." So, I did what every normal pastor's kid, full of black sheep vinegar, I lied and went and took a climbing class and started climbing behind their back. So I climbed all 4 years of high school without my parents knowing about it.
How did you pull that off?
It was not easy, especially climbing in Josh with the gobies all over your hands. And, I would chalk it up to skateboard accidents and all that kind of stuff. But yeah, I just doing some crazy stuff too, because, I was only 13. So I had to bum rides, and I used to hop freight trains.
Wow.
There was a bouldering area east of where I was living. It was about 30 miles east, called Mount Rubidoux out on the riverside. And so to get out there, I'd sometimes either hitchhike or hop freight trains. So, the things I was doing that my parents knew nothing about,
Things you can get away with back then.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. It was some crazy times, pushing the envelope. But
Yeah.
so that's how it all started. And I took a class and was out in Joshua Tree at Quail Springs picnic area there, Trash Can Rock, we called it. And I had a pair of tennis shoes. I couldn't afford any climbing gear. So, the only thing I had was a Swami belt. I managed to scrape up enough money to buy a Swami belt.
Will you describe a Swami belt for me?
Yeah, it was just a piece of 2-inch flat webbing, kind of like what we'd, runner material, but 2 inches wide and about 20 feet long. And you'd just wrap it around your waist, right about your belly button level, and as many times as it would go around, and then tie a water knot in it and then tie the rope right into that.
No, like leg loops? You weren't doing any sort of...
No.
Oh my gosh.
No leg loops. So yeah, that's one of the reasons we considered it a no-fall sport back then, because your ribs would take the brunt of, get these big welts. But anyway, I took a pair of these tennis shoes that I bought at Kmart, or actually my parents bought them for me. But I went out in my dad's garage and I took a rasp and I filed off the tread off the tennis shoes.
Wow.
And those were my first climbing shoes. And the chalk bag was old Crown Royal, the purple bags that Crown Royal whiskey comes in. That was a chalk bag. So anyway, I took that class and that lit a fire. And I was the only kid in the class, and the rest were mostly middle-aged folks. And I think it was about 11 of us. And I just, the teacher, the instructor, who was more of a mountaineer than a rock climber. I mean, I was out climbing him. He couldn't do some of the routes that, top ropes that he'd set up. And then most of the adults were there just to play around. They weren't really, that psyched on the sport like I was. And so the instructor saw my enthusiasm, and he ended up introducing me to 2 climbing friends of his that were out there in the park. And so the next day, these guys were old. They were like 19. I considered them really old guys. But they said, they kind of looked me over, and I was just this tiny little kid. I was the runt of the litter in my family. And they said, "Kid, if you're going to climb with us, you got to do your share of the leading." And they handed me a sling with a bunch of hexes and nuts on it. And, this was 1975, years before cams were available. And they walked me up to the base of a route called Double Cross out in Josh. And, I didn't know any better. It was, I think it's still rated 5.8.
I think it's 5.7 plus.
Is that what it is?
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I know a lot of people have died on it, over the course of my career there. But
jeez, wow.
At any rate, I scratched my way up that thing. And, slamming it. I'd never placed gear before. I just kind of learned by doing, and by the grace of God, got up the thing with no falls. But I got to the top of that thing. I couldn't speak. I was cotton mouth, shaking, and with the biggest smile on my face. And these guys, were just completely blown away that I'd scratched my way up that thing. And then the next day we went out and did Walk on the Wild Side
Mm.
out on Saddle Rocks. And so those were my first two leads
Stout.
in Kmart tennis shoes.
That's wild.
Yeah. So I remember being really afraid of falling on the Swami belt too. So I think that's one of the things that made me scratch even harder. And I remember on Double Cross, I just got so stinking torn up. My hands were just shredded. But again, I got to the top, and in spite of being cotton-mouthed and completely trashed, I was as happy as could be.
Yeah. Prove to yourself that you were a climber, essentially.
Yeah. And that was it, man. And it was all about, it was game on from there on. And Joshua Tree and Talkeets in the summer, and then, gravitating up to Camp 4 for the summer season.
Let's be real for a second. The current blueprint for a successful climbing podcast is simple. Interview the best climbers in the world. Big names mean big followings, lots of SEO power, and a built-in audience that helps boost every episode. But this show has never been about that. From the beginning, I have made it my mission to bring you stories from the climbing majority. The climbers who don't live in the limelight. The ones who avoid interviews, quietly put up routes, and give back in ways that are rarely recognized. And while that's what makes this show special, it also means we have an uphill battle when it comes to growth. And that is where you come in. If you're psyched about the show, if you've been inspired, entertained, or fired up about an episode, word of mouth is the single most important way you can help the show. Share an episode with a friend. Play one on a group road trip. Post about the show on social media. Jump onto Reddit threads and Mountain Project forums and share with people what you've been listening to. Be sure to tag the show, tag your favorite guests, and spread the word. And if you want to help even more, I'm currently sending posters to climbing gyms around the country. If you'd like to sport one in your climbing gym, be sure to reach out. Email me at theclimbingmajoritypodcast@gmail.com, and I will be sure to send you one. Let's band together and show the climbing community that the climbing majority has a voice. And so, Joshua Tree, Talkeets, Camp 4, these are iconic areas and places that the Stone Masters were climbing in, people like Bob Gaines. You're part of that generation. So talk to me about your proximity to these legends that we hear about, and kind of what was your experience with that?
Yeah. So, it was, you got to understand, it was a totally different world back then, climbing was. And, now it's just so mainstream with gyms and
Olympics.
Everyone and their uncle climbing now. But back then we were kind of like outcasts. I went to a high school of almost 4,000 kids, and I didn't know one other climber in that entire school.
Mm.
And when I told people that I climbed rocks, they'd look at me like, what's wrong with you? Why would you do that? So it was, we were kind of a rare breed, I guess you call it. It was just different. And so when you'd go out to the monument, you'd always see the same people, everyone was there, and the season moved from Josh to Talkeets and Suicide, and then up to the valley or the east side, Tuolumne. And so you'd always see the same folks. And so, that was right in the height of the Stone Masters. And, of course, I was just this little kid, and they were like gods, And I remember the first time seeing John Long. He and Lynn Hill were dating at the time, and John was just wicked fit back then, and Lynn was just this tiny little thing, and she was riding on his shoulder. They were cruising around doing some bouldering. It was just about dark, and we were scratching around doing some bouldering, but you'd see everyone. Everyone would camp at Hidden Valley and be setting up rope in the evening, and daring each other to do this and that and the other thing, and it was just a crazy time. But one guy that I definitely gravitated to, because he was a fellow Christian, he was a guy out of San Diego named Tobin Sorensen, and I just really admired him. He was a really bold climber, and really bold in his faith, which was something that impressed me. And it was just it impressed me that someone would be that bold in that environment. And this isn't to disparage the Stone Masters or that whole crew back then, but there was a lot of weed getting smoked and a lot of beer consumed
Mm.
and other consumables. So it was that kind of environment. But for me, Tobin was kind of a shining light.
Mm.
And then there were others. I remember first meeting Backer, and John was he was just doing things that every day that were so mesmerizing. And so we would just start following him around, just to watch. And I couldn't afford a camera, let alone the film, or the developing. You had to develop your film back then, and so it's unfortunate that a lot of these things I don't have pictures of, but some of the stuff we would see, and it now they're just tales we tell around the fire. Were you there that day? Oh yeah, I remember you were there. It's pretty fun. But those were the days, man.
Do you have a standout memory with John Backer that you care to share?
Well, gosh, I have a lot, and it's interesting that over the whole course of my climbing career, I mean, it seemed like John's and my path continued to cross, and ultimately he moved to the east side. And in fact, when his home burned down in the park, and for us he had asked me to rebuild his home, and then it got into the big scrabble with the Park Service and stuff, and it was unfortunate. But yeah, just lots of memories of John. I think my favorite climbing memory of John was I was up at Talkeets, and it was the first time I finally got up the guts to lead the Vampire, which is like the most bold line on Talkeets. It just goes up this blank, beautiful shield. It's very Yosemite-esque, and and John was kind of lurking, and I'd seen him down at Humber Park down below when we were gearing up, and so he was around, and anyway, my partner and I started up the route, and I was up on the bologna slicer pitch, which is like the last pitch, and I dropped a piece. I dropped a stopper, and it went to the ground. And anyway, I get up the pitch and then belay my partner up, and we're hanging out on the summit, and all of a sudden Backer comes soloing up, in a pair of shorts and no shirt, and we wore real tall tube socks back then. It was just kind of the thing. And he comes cruising up, and he reaches back into his chalk bag and pulls out my stopper, and he hands it to me, and he says, "Hey, Dean, quit littering." So
Legend.
that was kind of cool. But yeah, I had some really great interactions with John up in Mammoth once he had his son Tyrus, and I really saw a beautiful change that happened in John when Tyrus was born, and that was real special. Because I had become a father shortly before that, and he was kind of giving me grief one day in the coffee shop about gosh, you got kids now, you're all tied down, and I said, yeah, but John, it's a whole new way of life, and it's magic, and it's really special. And he was kind of like, yeah, whatever.
Mm-hmm.
And then not too long thereafter, he was the father of Tyrus, and I saw him again in town, and he said, Dean, I get it now. I get what you were talking about. And there he's got little baby Tyrus in his arms. It was pretty cool.
That's cool.
A very special memory for me.
It's really cool that it wasn't just I remember seeing John Long and Jade Tree or John Backer and Jade Tree, years ago. It's like, no, you continued to kind of cross paths over the years, that's really, really cool.
Yeah, it was, that was a hard loss.
Mm-hmm.
That one was hard.
What, I mean, we don't need to go into it too much, but in his later years, do you think he still was like very risk on, or was it just more of just happenstance where you solo enough times accidents happen?
Well, there's been a lot of speculation about that, and I don't really have evidence to say one way or another. I think I think John was just so good at what he did, and I love I loved his approach to things that there was purity in it. I remember back, it was just so disappointing when back in the 80s when this whole trad versus rad thing, all the European, you know, bolting on rappel stuff came in and there was a lot of tension there and that was unfortunate because it hurt a lot of friendships and stuff. Um, and so John was just such an interesting guy and just so committed in his beliefs and his style, and I respected that and still respect it a lot. And, that's kind of more the way I lean as opposed to the other way. Um, so I saw a lot of hard paths that John walked through, and it was unfortunate and, hurt a lot of long-term friendships and stuff. But I just had to admire the guy's commitment to excellence.
Mm.
I think that's the thing that when I think of John, I think, man, that guy was just committed to excellence, and he was just so smooth. And the route that he ended up losing his life on, was obviously well within his skill set, and who knows how many times he'd actually climbed the route. So, things happen, unfortunately, and that day didn't end well for him or the rest of us.
Yeah. Yeah, soloing's that's a tough one to justify over long periods of time. I think you're just testing it a bit much.
Yeah, I've done my share, and I always found it fun, but I wasn't ever doing anything like what he was doing. I think well, I had a couple big days. I did 3 laps on the regular route on Fairview up in Tuolumne, and that was kind of fun. Passing the same party.
They're like, wait a second, I'm in the Matrix.
Yeah, it was kind of fun. And then on my 50th birthday, I soloed the 3rd pillar of Dana.
Whoa, no way.
Yeah, it's a route I'd done a few times before, so I knew the route well. And
wow.
And yeah, I actually had a partner lined up, and then at the last minute, he kind of bailed, and I really wanted to climb on my birthday. It was kind of my thing. I always climbed on my birthday. So
that's a stout lead.
I just decided to go in and do it. And I climbed the route in like 40 minutes.
Good for you.
Yeah, it was fun.
That's awesome.
And I reveled in it. It was never, and I had the whole route to myself too. That was kind of nice.
Mm-hmm.
So, anyway.
Cool.
But I didn't make soloing a real big habit.
Yeah. Only few can. Tell me about, kind of rounding you out more as a young self, as kind of a climber. You have a story about EBGBs in J-Tree. Tell me that quick story.
Yeah, so that was a real test piece. That route got put up, I think it was in 77, and man, the word went around the campground like a wildfire, that route had gotten established. And I remember the first time I'd heard about it, we walked over to it the next morning, and I remember standing there at the base, and I was only 15 years old. And I looked up at that thing, and it just gave me shivers. It just has this really amazing position, and you could see the tiny little button head bolts, just barely showing on that massive face, and it just freaked me out, and so it became something that, I thought, well, I'll work up to that. And so a number of times, shortly after it was put up, I would go up to the base, and just starting the route, you have to do this mantle, because the thing's on like this huge block. So you got to mantle up onto this pedestal kind of a thing. And it's a little awkward, and it's kind of right in your face. And so even that first move's kind of challenging. And then you do this kind of do-si-do left, kind of shimmy left to another clip. And then you turn this kind of an arete thing, and then you're out onto the main face. And, I went up a couple of times, clipped that first bolt, and started doing the shimmy, and then chickened out, and then I finally got a pair of EBs, I finally upgraded, and up to that point, I had been buying like secondhand, third-hand shredded climbing shoes from people in the valley, that were trying to get money to go back to England or wherever they were from. And so I think a new pair of EBs back then was about $45, and I got a brand new pair of EBs, and I was 17 at the time. So this would have been 1979. So I went up to the route, and I was super psyched and motivated and felt like these new shoes were going to do it for me. And so I just used a runner, that was tied with a water knot, just a 1-inch piece of webbing for a rack. And I slapped a couple of quick draws. We called them quick runners back then. And I had like, however many runners it was going to take to do the route. And I made the mantle and did the shimmy left and turned the corner, and then got up on the main face, clipped the third bolt, and then the things just run out. I think there's only five bolts on the whole route, so it's a run out deal, and super steep and thin and smeary and edgy, and I'm way out above my third clip, and all of a sudden I hear this clinking. And the water knot had untied in my sling, and all of my gear went to the base.
Oh my gosh.
And the only other beaner I had was the one on my harness holding my stitch plate. I had a harness by then. I wasn't in a Swami. But I was just freaked, and my partner was freaked, and he's like, "You should just jump." And I mean, it would have been a whip down off the block and swinging down under the overhang below, and I was just terrified, and resetting my feet and chalking, and I don't know how much time elapsed, but finally I just decided to climb. I felt like that was my option, was just to climb. So I climbed that thing to the top, in full ground fall mode, and I collapsed on the summit, and I couldn't even speak for about 15 minutes. I was just so thrashed. And my partner was so intimidated. He just flat out refused to follow the route. he was just
emotionally shocked by that point. Yeah.
And he didn't climb much after that. He kind of gave up climbing, and I think
Wow,
that was one of the reasons. I mean, it just really shook him up that he thought he was going to see me, just fully crater.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah.
But for you, it seems like similar to your double cross incident, where risk high, risk on, get to the top, and you've almost proved something to yourself.
Well, I didn't do that by choice. I mean, I was in full survival mode,
Well, whether you chose it or not, you're still in that situation, and you still chose to push forward. And
yeah,
it sounds to, at least to me, you can correct me if I'm wrong, but it sounds to me like you kind of proved something to yourself at the top.
Well, I think I thought that well after the fact. It took a while for my frayed nerves to calm down. I realized then that I had come really close, and so that was one of my 23 close calls. But yeah, it was I guess a kind of a watershed moment. At that point I'd been climbing for 4 years, and between the shoes, the brand new EBs, which I thought were just like the bomb compared to everything I'd been climbing in up to that point. Between the shoes and my willingness to just push through and steel the mind to stay in the game, stay really focused. It was a great experience. In hindsight, it was a great experience.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's like a skill set that you proved to yourself that you had, that you're able to stay focused and in control in intense and life-threatening situations. I think that's a skill. It's a skill set, and I would imagine one that you used quite a lot after the fact.
Yeah, and I've always said that incidents like that, these close calls and stuff, I consider them like storms in our lives, and and you weather those storms, and it makes you stronger for the next one, so you can, when you're facing the next storm, you can kind of think back and go, well, I've pushed it hard before, it's just, I know what it takes. You raise that mental game and you just stay in the fight.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, I think every one of those, in spite of the close call, you come away better for it, in that you've gleaned some really valuable information about yourself.
Mm-hmm.
Not so much maybe the physical, but what's up here, between the ears, like really stealing your mind for desperate situations. And in my case, that really paid dividends once my SAR career started.
I send professional recording equipment to every single guest to ensure that you get top tier audio and video quality, and those costs add up. Right now, the show is also completely ad-free, and I would love to keep it that way. So if you've been enjoying the Climbing Majority podcast, would like to help keep this podcast ad-free, and want to help me cover shipping costs, consider joining our Patreon. For as little as $5 a month, you can help support the show, and you'll get access to exclusive episodes. You can find the link in our show notes, or head to patreon.com/the Climbing Majority podcast. That's patreon.com/the Climbing Majority podcast. So I want to kind of like bridge the gap between your experience as a climber and your experiences in SAR. And to me, that bridge is Lost Arrow Spire. You've rescued a lot of people in your life, but that doesn't mean that you've not been on the other side of that coin. So to me, this story really just paints the picture of kind of the situations you found yourself in on Lost Arrow Spire are kind of the situations you helped other people out of after the fact. So tell me about that epic on Lost Arrow Spire when you were kind of a budding climber, and how, honestly, it was one of the main first times where you like thought you might not get out of a situation like that.
Yeah, so that was in 1983, in June of 83, and I had been climbing then for a little over 8 years. I was in the valley and I needed a partner. And so I moseyed over to the mountain shop in Curry and was just kind of hanging out and seeing who was around, and most of my buddies up there were paired up with someone. So these 5 guys came in, and I overheard them asking some of the guides there about information on climbing the spire, doing the spire tip. And that was something that I really had always wanted to do, and so I just kind of wormed my way in, and as they were leaving, I just kind of hung out with them and followed them back to the shuttle bus, and we went back to Camp 4 and basically sat around the fire that evening making plans to go do the spire the next day.
Mm.
So it was 6 of us, and thought it would work out great with 3 teams of 2, and we geared up and hiked up the trail. And again, this was early June, and we just made a rookie mistake and didn't check the weather. Didn't check the weather forecast. So we were full of juice and shorts and t-shirts, and just a couple of light day packs with some food and water, and hiked up the trail, set up the rope, wrapped down in. It's about 280-foot wrap down off the wall. You got to pass the knot on the way down. We were climbing on, 165-foot ropes back then. And, a breeze started, and we got down, as we were getting down to the notch, which is the ledge where the spire sticks out of the wall. And this breeze started, and, it wasn't too bad, but, the first team, the 2 guys started up, and, with every minute that went by, the breeze kept picking up more and more, and it was a concern. And then the breeze turned into a wind, and we were starting to get occasional spray coming off the falls. In early June, the falls are just raging. about this time of the year,
Mm-hmm.
June 5th. And any rate, shortly thereafter, within about an hour of us all starting up the route, or the first team starting up the route, these clouds just started pouring over the rim like low clouds, and it started spitting rain, which turned to sleet, real sticky sleet, and it turned sour real fast, and wind picked up, more mist coming off the waterfall, and we were just getting soaked. And at that point, the second party had already started climbing behind the first party, and I was going to be in the last party, so I never got on the route. But all of a sudden, it was like we were in trouble, and we knew we had to bail. And so, the first team had the trail line on, the wrap line on, clipped to their harness, and unfortunately, they didn't. Had they dropped that down for us, we could have started evac and back Jumar and back up the line. But that didn't happen, and later we found out they were just afraid that if they dropped it, it might get hung up with the way the wind was swirling and stuff, and so that's why they didn't drop the line. But eventually, everyone got back to the notch, and by then, I mean, the weather was just so poor, and first couple of guys tried to start jugging up the line, and we were so hypothermic by then, just trying to make that effort was horrendous. And, the amount of water coming down and sleet, and I mean, there was water running down the wall. It was crazy. So we were really pinned down and couldn't get up the line. And so we were kind of in this, I called it a scrum when I share this story in my book. We were kind of in this scrum, just hugging each other and trying to stay warm. And I knew enough about hypothermia at that point that I knew we needed to do something, and so I suggested that we try and wrap the wall, wrap all the way down.
We're talking like 1,000 feet at least.
Yeah, it's like something like that.
Mm-hmm. And
1,100 feet.
no established anchors.
No, at that time, there was nothing. We never found anything. So we had the gear that we had with us. We had 4 ropes, which was helpful. The first party that was going up the route, they climbed using a double rope technique. So that was came in handy that we had that extra rope. But so we kind of had a little bit of a personal war going on about whether we should attempt that or not. But I was just afraid we were going to die there on that ledge. And I mean, all of us were really, really in bad shape, especially the first 2 guys that had gone up on the spire. And they were the strongest of the team, certainly in personality and motivation. But by then they were pretty much rendered, ineffective just from the effects of the cold. So, by then the clouds were just pouring down, and we were basically in a fog. When you looked off from the notch, down the wall, you couldn't see, but maybe 20 feet, and then the rope just disappeared into the clouds.
Wow.
And so I tied the first 2 ropes together, and I just said, look, I'll go down and see what I can see. I'll go to the end of the ropes and see if there's a place for anchors, and, try and keep the anchors as much to a minimum. But there was going to be, not all at once, but eventually 6 of us on anchors. So I hope to keep it to 3 pieces with each anchor. So I just started down that way and got to the end of the ropes, came out of the clouds, which was really spooky because all of a sudden you see the exposure, you're like, oh. But I mean, we were so intimidated, and I was just when I had to urinate, I just let it go in my shorts. It was like we were
full survival mode.
Yeah, we were in full survival mode. So you were just focusing on trying to stay safe and make good decisions, and so it just became a series of rappels, and gosh, I feel like I don't want to share too much because it's a great story in the book.
It is a great story in the book. I think the details of each rappel. Obviously, I think, like you said, we can get in. Read the book if you're interested in the play by play. I thought one of the main things I thought was very striking was your carabiner anchor.
Yeah, I got pretty desperate. That was as we were getting closer to the base. I was running out of gear, and especially for anything wide, because the crack there, the series of cracks started out really wide. At one point our anchor was a chalk stone that was lodged in the crack. It was about the size of a football, which was great. That saved us some gear. But by the time I got that low, I think we were maybe 450 feet from the ground. And I only had one piece. I think it was a friend, about 2.5 friend. And so I put that in, but I needed another big piece and I didn't have it. Excuse me. I didn't have it. So I reached back on the back of my harness. I had 2 locking carabiners and I unclipped one. And as I brought it around, I was going to use it as a chalk, right? As a stopper basically. And as I brought it around, and my hands, everything was just so numb from the cold and stuff. And I bumped it against the rack and I dropped it.
Oh my God.
And I just started whimpering, like just fully in tears practically. And so I reached back, grabbed the other one, brought it around and just started fumbling with it and managed to, get it to a place where I thought it was going to work. And then I tied off a couple of slings to it, and I stepped in it like an aider, and I just kind of bounced on it like you do an aid piece.
Mm-hmm.
And I just ground the thing into the crack, and it really seated in there. And so I tied that off, and then I got one other small piece, it was kind of Jengus, but I got it in there. And so that was our anchor. And I think I mentioned this in the book, I was so focused and also so delirious from the cold and exhausted and everything. And, by then we'd been rappelling for like 6 hours. And I was just so out of it. And the first guy that came down, he was a guy named Carl. He came down to me after I got that anchor set. And he's like, "What happened to your hands?" And I didn't even realize, but my hands were all bloody. And the only thing I could figure was, in the process of trying to get that thing in there in the crack and bouncing on it and stuff, I just totally shredded my hands and they were just bleeding all over everything. And that's how out of it I was with the cold and stuff. I don't have any recollection of that at all. But it worked.
That's wild. And I think it's cool it's a representation of how out of the box we can all be. And I talked to Silas Rossi recently, and we talked about the difference between like memorizing what we're supposed to do versus conceptualizing why. And I think that like that's a prime example of like the application of conceptualization, right? It's like you understand the concept behind passive gear, and you are able to use something that's not necessarily told to use as passive gear, but you understood the principles behind it and you were able to make something work. So
yeah, I think I look back on that and think that that was one of the advantages of starting climbing when I did. Again, we didn't have cams, so we were using pins and then stoppers and hexes. And hex is kind of like a big chalk stone, and whenever you saw a natural chalk stone, you would use it just to save gear, right? And so when you have that mindset, anything could be a chalk stone. So how about a carabiner,
Yeah.
So
it's good advice.
It worked. Someone, I don't know, as hard as I jumped on that thing's probably still welding in there all these years later, but maybe somebody hammered it out of there for booty.
That would be really cool to get that carabiner.
Wouldn't it? Yeah. Yeah, it was an SMC. I can tell you that.
Okay, nice. The other thing that stood out to me about that story was how much doubt you had about the girlfriends back on the ground calling for a rescue.
Yeah.
And surprise, surprise, in the end, they were kind of a huge catalyst for the reasons why the SAR team was able to get up to you.
They were, yeah. And, and that goes back to that kind of battle we were having at the notch, what do we do? And the 2 guys whose girlfriends were with them on the trip, were down in the valley, and they were certain, they just had this certainty that the gals were going to report us in trouble. And they had certainly seen us leave the campsite that morning down at Camp 4, just in shorts and T-shirts with no extra stuff. But I just said, we can't. My feeling was we couldn't afford to wait, right? I mean, if they didn't report us in trouble, I mean, I made a comment like they're probably shopping or hanging out at the beach or something, and I caught some wrath from those two guys, But I just didn't feel like we could wait. But yeah, we were about halfway down the wall, and all of a sudden we hear this voice on a bullhorn, and so they had reported us, and the SAR team started hiking up the falls trail, and then they got up about halfway up the trail, about half height on Yosemite Falls, and they spotted us across the wall. So they started yelling, talking to us through the bullhorn, and then they disappeared. We were just stoked, that someone was coming for us, and we were able to obey their signals, and wave back and all that. And unbeknownst to us, they called down, radioed down and sent another team to hike up from like Yosemite Point Buttress and up to the base of where we were coming down. So, by the time we were within maybe 500 feet of being on the deck, we could see the team down there gearing up, ready for our arrival.
Must have been a relief.
Oh my gosh. Yeah. And I just remember, we were so numb, and it took so much effort to do things when you're that out of it, both mentally and physically. And just seeing them scampering around, it was like ants, just moving around very, very methodically, very quickly, and they were setting up tube tents and stuff, just getting ready for our arrival. And I just remember thinking, wow, look at how fast, how can they move that fast? It was just, the mind was not working so well, but pretty numb.
And another thing about that story that caught me off guard was that you never spoke or saw these people that you went through this like super profound experience with again, like the other 4 climbers, like Carl, no one, you didn't see anybody?
Five other guys. So we got down, they took us, it was well after dark. We ended up in the clinic there and spent the night at the clinic. And, we were all afraid, we were all young kids, we were all afraid we were going to get this huge bill and stuff. And so we kind of refused everything. And those girlfriends of those 2 guys, they had went over to Degnan's and got a bunch of food. And so we're just, we were chomping on pizza and stuff and just kind of replenishing the bellies. And, we went back over to camp, and, that next morning they decided to bail. They had all come from Colorado, and, this was 1983. So cell phones didn't exist and all that. So,
hey, what's your Instagram?
Yeah, none of that was happening. So, I remember writing out, I actually tore out a page out of my guidebook. It was the only paper I had. I tore out the page out of the back of the, just one of the blank pages in the very back of the book. And I wrote my name and my address and the phone number of where I was living. And then I wrote on the note, I said, let's go climbing next time.
Yeah.
So, I never heard from him again.
Wow.
Yeah. And
I would imagine wondered.
That was one of those experiences that could have easily made anyone just go, you know what? I think I'm going to take up,
bird watching.
Yeah. Anything but this. But to me, it was like, it was a hard experience to go through, but again, kind of like what happened on EBGBs that day, you learn from those experiences, and you kind of, the first thing I did was just thank you, Laura. I just remember coming to, I was pretty out of it, in my head when I got down. And the next thing I remember that night was waking up, kind of coming to, and they were, all these SAR guys were just asking me tons of questions and, trying to get my mojo back, and feeding me some bouillon in a cup. And I just remember thanking God over and over again, those guardian angels, because that was such a close call. And at that point in my life, that was like the closest call that I'd had in my climbing career. Yeah. And then a year later, Laura went missing, and then that's when my SAR career started.
Yeah. Wow.
Yeah.
So interesting how life pushes us in certain directions almost.
Yeah. Yeah. And, you can make a choice on whether you let those kinds of things define you, or count them as a learning experience. And if they define you, more often than not, it's gonna make you quit. You're just gonna say, and I suspect maybe that's what happened with those guys, or I mean, who knows?
I mean, it's a completely rational thing to do, I would say, to
Yeah.
quit in a situation like that.
Yeah.
It's like, okay, yeah, I get it. Yeah, hats off to you. Totally understand. But I think more just your situation where, you've seen death at the base of Bridalveil Falls. You've had these close calls climbing. The lady, what's her name again? I'm so sorry. Went missing in Jade Tree.
Oh, a little girl, Laura Bradbury.
Laura Bradbury. She went missing, and you were around that. I don't think a lot of all of these events and all these things are happening in this this order. And it just seems to me like the universe is, or God, or whatever is been pushing you down this path that you've almost kind of meant to be on.
It's interesting that you bring that up. I had this wild experience. I was a builder for my career, and I was doing this project on the western side of the Sierra, west of Tahoe. And my clients asked me to drive them to the airport in Sacramento early one morning, like 3 a.m. And so I took them and I dropped them off, and I was heading back to the project, and I had stopped for a coffee, and it just hit my system, and I really had to find a bathroom quick. And I was in an area of Sacramento that I didn't know, I wasn't sure where I was, and it was like now 4:30 in the morning. So I find this gas station, and I pull in, and I I go up to use the bathroom, and I go to open the door, and there's a body laying on the floor in front of the toilet.
Oh my God.
Yeah. And I'm like, geez, I can't get away from this stuff. It's like everywhere I go,
Was he just passed out?
No, he was dead. I mean,
my
I reached
God.
down and checked his carotid pulse, and the guy was dead. I mean,
Wow.
he was a street guy, and smelled a lot of alcohol and stuff. And, it was clear he'd been living on the street, but yeah, he died. I mean, and I had to go so bad,
Yeah.
And I mean, I would have had to put my feet on his chest to sit down on the toilet. It was,
wow.
That's where he was. And it actually, I immediately, I had to go so bad. I immediately went into the women's bathroom next door, and I finally got the relief. So I'm sitting there on the toilet, and I called 911. So I'm sitting there, and like the response time was epically quick, because all of a sudden I hear the sirens, and I see the flashing lights coming from underneath the bathroom door, and I'm in there trying to get business done, and finally come out the door, and all these lights are on me, And
wow.
Anyway, it was pretty wild, but
wow.
Yeah, and I had other stuff like I took my wife. We would often on our anniversary go climb a peak, and she saw me. We were, I was gearing up the night before, and she saw me put my radio in my pack, my SAR radio. And she goes, "Why are you bringing that?" And I said, "Because it's me, because it's the way that life seems to go for me." Well, sure enough, we climbed the peak, and on the descent, we came across a guy walking on his hands and knees, a fisherman who had snapped his ankle fishing at a backcountry lake and was trying to crawl out. So we got him out, the two of us. Yeah, it's been a while. I think that that's one of the reasons I think that this is a calling. This has been a calling on my life. God has used me and put me in situations where I could be effective, and so I was just always prepared for that, no matter what. I mean, I basically I still am. I have my first aid kit in my truck all the time, even though I'm not with SAR anymore. I stop at every car accident I see to just see if I can help out.
Do you is it to the point where you are seeking it out in a way? Not in like, I hope something bad happens to somebody, not like that, but like where there's an element of hope that you can find someone to help? Or is it just like absolutely random where it's just like, you come across this kind of situation very frequently?
Yeah, no. So, for me, it's a first responder mentality is, when that call comes in, your mindset is you respond to that call wanting to save a life, right? That's your goal, to do whatever it takes to affect that rescue or search mission. And so I've done it. I did that for so many years, with so many missions that's just become my mindset. And so, I go out to do my climbs or hikes or whatever I'm going to go do, wanting to have fun, but knowing that, hey, if something does happen, and I hope it doesn't, but if it does happen, I want to be effective. I want to be able to make a difference, and be significant for someone who's maybe not having one of their better days. So, I guess I was never a Boy Scout, but I guess the Boy Scout motto is always be prepared. And, that's just the way I like to go. That's the way I like to roll. Like, I want to be able to be a change agent for somebody who's in trouble, and hopefully I'm prepared enough to do that. So
Yeah.
just
No,
a
I think
mindset.
it's a good way to be.
Yeah.
And yeah, I mean, I think that, yeah, if you, it's like, what's that rule? Like, prepare for something and it will inevitably happen. Don't prepare for something like, and it might not happen. It's like that juxtaposition. It's like, okay, if I plan for this to happen, then it's probably going to happen because I planned for it. But if I like didn't bring the first aid kit, maybe, I didn't plan for it, so it's not going to happen, but then you're leaving yourself up to chance of like, okay, well, if it does happen, you're fucked. So it's like, you might as well be prepared.
Yeah. Prepare for the worst and hope for the best, and, I like to tell people, when I'm doing my presentations, I like to tell the audience, as a SAR team, we want people to go out and enjoy the wilderness with a mindset of getting themselves out of their predicament. Because once you call for SAR response, you're putting the lives of good people in danger. And so you should really be sure that you're justified in that call, and do everything that you can. Obviously, if there are some situations where you absolutely need the help, but if you can get yourself out, do that. And so when I go out to do my own stuff, climbs or whatever, I'm prepared for that, both with the stuff that I bring and, mainly mentally, just have a plan. I like to always tell people in my presentations, have an emergency plan. If you're going to go in, you're going to a certain route or whatever, have a plan for what if this happens? What if that happens?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So
yeah, you said your personal rules for traveling in the mountains alone. Let someone know where you're going and when you plan to return. Don't take the same risks you would with a partner. So like that's if you're going alone. Hubris will get you killed. And then the third is stick to the plan. And I think that's the big one, right? It's like you're going to tell someone where you go, and then you end up not going to that place and you go missing. Where the hell are people supposed to look for you?
Yeah. So I'd love to spend a little bit of time on this subject because this is really the heart of search and rescue. Okay. If you hear anything in this interview, hear this. The best thing a SAR team has on a rescue response isn't their personnel. It's the information that we get from what we call the RP, the reporting party, the person who reports you overdue, missing, injured, what have you, because we're going to use that information. And so leaving an itinerary is the most important thing that any backcountry user can do. And an itinerary needs to be the more detailed, the better. And what I'm about to say, a lot of people will think I'm being ridiculous, but I'll explain why I'm going to say these things. Most people think an itinerary is, oh, I told my wife that, we're going to go climb Mount Ritter and then we're going to leave from the trailhead and do it car to car in a day. So that's where the car will be parked, and they call that their itinerary. Well, that's not a very good itinerary. I mean, that's got the basics. We want to know where you're starting and where you're going and where you're going to end. But put in that itinerary everything you can, everything that you're carrying with you in your pack, what brand of pack you have, what shoes you're wearing. I even tell people, take a photocopy of your shoe print, okay, and leave that with the person that's going to be reporting you missing. So you're leaving your itinerary with whoever, your spouse or whoever's going to report you overdue, right? And then everything that's in your pack, right down to your chapstick and whether it's regular flavor or grape or strawberry. And here's the reason why we want all those details. When a SAR team looks for missing people, we don't look for the person. We look for clues that lead to the person. And so if we know that you have a certain piece of gear or clothing, a certain color hat with a logo on it, whatever it is, your footprint, we're going to search for those things, and that's going to help guide us to you. Okay, that'll be one tool. Now, the importance of sticking to your itinerary is that's what as a STAR team, that's what we're going to be following is your itinerary. So if the itinerary says we're going to go up and climb Mount Ritter by the North Ridge and then descend the South Ridge and back to the trailhead, well, when you're back there and you've made good time and you decide, hey, we've got time, let's go tag Banner Peak while we're here. The summit's just a few hours. It's right there. Don't do it. Save it for another day. Because if the injury happens over there, that's not where we're going to be searching for you. And eventually we might find you, but it might be too late depending upon your injuries and your situation. So stick to your itinerary, and we're going to be following it to you. Very important.
So in that example of like the secondary objective,
Yeah.
could we maybe plan for, if we make good time, we're going to take this objective
Sure.
down,
Put it in your itinerary.
Put it in the itinerary.
100%. Yep. Because then what we would do is we'd send two teams. One team's going to go climb Ritter. The other one's going to do Banner. That's how we would pull that off. You're always trying to shorten that span between reported missing and the find. So, because you don't know what the injury is, what the situation is. So, yeah.
When we're traveling alone, how can we ensure, if we do get ourselves in a situation and we're not able to use a GPS transcoder to call for rescue, how do we ensure that people report us missing sooner or in time enough to do something valuable?
Well, hopefully you've left your itinerary in a time with that person. And circling back a little bit, whoever you leave all this information with has to be a very responsible person. Whether it's your spouse or girlfriend, boyfriend, or whoever it's going to be, you tell them you're going to be back by 7 p.m. on this night, and if you're not back, they're going to be the one making that phone call. Okay. As far as attracting response to you, and it sounds like maybe that was that what you were?
No, I guess like if I, let's say I'm going to be gone for 7 days.
Okay.
And I'm going to be back in my car in 7 days.
Yeah.
And I guess the answer to this question is to bring a spot device, so you can have communication with the outside world and
be helpful.
But I guess that's the answer to the question, right? Because if you go missing on day 1 and no one's expecting to hear back from you until day 7, that's 6 days that you have to survive before anybody even starts looking for you.
Right.
And so there's like a disparity there. But yeah, I guess the answer to that question is to bring a spot device.
Well, but there's other things that you can do. And so that's what I was leading up to is, there are other things that you can carry with you to attract attention to yourself. So hopefully there's someone else on the trail or maybe hiking through the valley below. And I can't stress this enough. You can't rely on your voice, because people that are injured, lost, whatever, in desperate situation, typically they're panicking, maybe in some shock from injury. and you'll blow out your vocal cords screaming as loud as you can. Your voice will only carry so far, even if it's not blown out, but you'll damage your vocal cords very quickly. So having a whistle, all the sports stores, REI, everybody, every climbing shop sells emergency whistles. That's great. And then, having a reflective device, and I've always told people, back in the days when DVDs and CDs were still a thing, but they're like the greatest signal mirror, because the back side is a mirror, right? And it's also got a hole in the center, so you can look through that and aim it at,
Oh, wow.
a team or a helicopter coming or whatever, and attract attention with that reflection. Okay. And then this is something that everyone needs to know, every user of the backcountry. The international distress signal. Do you know what it is?
No.
Well, you should. You read my
I
book.
should. Oh,
So it's not SOS. Okay.
It was,
The international distress signal is 3 of anything. So
Oh,
3 flashes of light and then stop, and then 3 flashes of light and stop, or 3 whistle blasts in a row and then stop, and 3 more. We were on a mission for a missing backpacker who got trapped by an early snowfall. It snowed like 2.5 feet, and his RP, whoever reported him overdue, said that he wasn't prepared for that gear wise. And so my partner and I were being flown in by a helo to a location to start up high and work down on the trail that he was supposedly going to be hiking on. And as we were approaching our LZ, where we were going to land the helo and get dropped off, from probably at least a quarter mile away, we spotted 3 parallel trenches that were like 30 feet long, stomped in the snow. And we spotted it from 400 or 500 yards away from the helo.
Mm-hmm.
And it, and then the guy made those marks, and it drew us to it. And then from there we sat down, and then my partner and I just got on his track, because he didn't stay there. He started trying to hike back out, and we just hiked on his track and caught up to him.
Wow. Cool.
Yeah. So 3 of anything. It's really a critical thing to know.
That's really, really good
And
information.
that's worldwide, wherever you're, if you're in Chamonix or wherever you're at, that'll work.
Interesting. Any other major things, tools, whether they're mental, like a mentality to have, physical things to have, knowledge to have, that we should know?
Well, there's a lot of things, but I think the best thing is having that mentality before you go, that you're going to do everything you can if you get in trouble to get yourself out. And then, do your best to pick objectives that are within your wheelhouse. And this has been kind of an interesting thing over the course of my career, because when I started in '84, again, none of this technology existed, right? No cell phones, no GPS, none of that was around. And so what I got to see over the course of my career, as all this technology became available, when I looked through my database of all of these missions, it's been really interesting to see the cause of events and the demographic of the victim. And interestingly, it's been more and more young men, young guys. And I can attribute it, I believe, to the whole Instagram, Facebook, the whole social media thing. I call it the GoPro mentality, and I love GoPro, but their motto is "Be a hero," right? And so these young guys and gals do it too, but they go out, and maybe they have the skill sets to do XYZ peak or climb or whatever, and then they get the hero shot, with their selfie stick, because you got to have one of those in the backcountry. Anyway, they get that shot, and maybe they go back to work after the weekend and they put that shot on their screen in their computer at work, or they just throw it up on Instagram, right? And all of a sudden they're the hero. Well, one of their buddies sees it and is like, "Ooh, man, my girl will think I'm all that if I go do that." Not even considering that he might not have the skill sets to do that, and then go out and try and do an objective that he doesn't have qualifications or not the right gear for, or what have you, and pay the price.
I think a perfect example of this is the East Buttress on Mount Whitney. Um,
Yeah,
and I think that
100%.
to me, the reason why it's the grade, right? I think that when we're in a gym, the only thing we're considering is the grade. It's like, okay, oh man, 5'11s are hard, oh, but I can do a 5'10. You're like 5'9, so you're like, you get so confident. You're like, yeah, I can do a
Yeah,
5'9. And so you buy the Mount Whitney book and you see that East Buttress or the East Face is 5'7 and 5'8. And you're like, you start talking yourself up. You're like, yeah, we got this. It's 5'8, dude. I just crushed a 5'10 in the gym, dude. It's
right,
gonna be
right.
so easy.
Yeah,
And so you talk yourself up, and um, coming straight from a gym, even if you've gone to a local crag a couple times, I think that we underestimate the power of the mountains and the topography and the landscape and just how far away from everything you find yourself when you're at the base of that route, and then you still have to climb it.
yeah,
And I think it really puts people out of their comfort zone. People start making bad decisions, coming in unprepared. I mean, I've interviewed someone that had an epic on Whitney, and they ended up having to hike down the whole hiker trail, come back up to the base, grab their stuff.
yeah,
It was a whole thing.
yeah,
But yeah, to me, that is the main reason why, along with people even finding out that these routes are a thing because of social media. But again, it's just the picture. There's no story behind it. You don't know who this person really is. You don't know what went into it. You don't know anything really. And it does become very easy for us to kind of like talk ourselves into putting ourselves exposed in these places where the grade is just the tip of the iceberg.
yeah. Picking the wrong objective. I mean, I remember being with a partner climbing up in Tuolumne. It's my favorite spot in the world that I've climbed, and it was near the end of the day, and we had just come off a route on Stately Pleasure, and we were hiking back to the car, and all of a sudden we heard, yells of help, someone yelling for help from up on high, and it was this guy and this gal up on South Crack, which is, it's only a 5'8" crack, but then you get up 3 pitches, and then it goes into some seriously long run out slab climbing, at like 5'7" with no protection. And so, my partner and I decided we were going to go up and help these folks. So we did the route up to them, and we get up to the guy, and it's like, what happened? And he's like, I just freaked out. He goes, I climbed 5'12" in the gym, but he looked at those runouts and he just
Yeah.
froze, and they didn't know how to wrap from there. So they were in a bit of a sitch. So yeah, you just got to pick the right objectives, and try and avoid getting. I mean, obviously, we've all done things where we've got ourselves into situations, but hopefully you have the wherewithal to get yourself out, and then if you don't, you make good decisions on how to alert for help. So
Talk to me about kind of the darker side towards people. So there's one side of the coin is I am going to do everything I can in my power to get out of the mountains and self extricate myself.
yeah.
What does it look like from the SARS perspective when someone is not only unprepared, but is kind of abusing the rescue system? What does that look like from your perspective, and kind of like paint the picture of who we don't want to be as outdoor athletes?
Yeah. Well, again, I'd circle back to what I said a few minutes ago about when you make that decision to call for SAR assistance, you're putting people's lives at risk, especially if we're going to be flying in the mountains in a helo. By far one of the most dangerous things I've ever done, and I've got a lot of time in those ships. And they're great crews, and it's not, I'm not disparaging the crews. It's just a dangerous thing to do. So you need to consider that. And there were a number of incidences over the course of my career where people abused the system, and maybe got just too tired and decided I'm going to call for SAR, and they'll get me out of here. You talk about an abuse of the system. That's as far as I'm concerned, that's criminal. Thankfully, for the most part, throughout my career, we're human beings, and people just flat out make mistakes. weather changes. Look at what I did on the Lost Arrow. I mean, the biggest mistake we made was not checking the weather, right? So, it can happen to anybody. I just think it's really important that we go in the backcountry with a mindset of doing everything we can to get ourselves out of the mess that we find ourselves in. And then really make good decisions. And it doesn't hurt to have, even REI teaches good emergency courses, on how to deal with backcountry situations. But I would recommend people to even go deeper than that and take some good first aid and advanced first aid courses. And really, if you want to, be the rock star, go through the wilderness first responder course. And it just makes you more confident and, really helps mitigate a situation that you might come upon. I remember one case we had, we got the report of an injured skier up on Mount Dana, which is right on the border of Yosemite and the county that I served in Multnomah County. And so these two guys were climbing the couloir on Dana, and they witnessed this guy. He was hiking up with his skis up the north face, and took a fall and got pretty banged up and was motionless on the side of the peak. And so they abandoned their climb, came down and went across, and then climbed up to the guy. And the guy had some serious head injury and was in and out of consciousness, and they did what they could with what they had to try and stop the bleeding on his head. And then they tied the guy off to the side of the mountain. And then both of those guys left to hike out to go get help. They didn't have cell phone. This was actually before cell phones. And they hiked out and left that head injured victim alone. And that's something that if you took any kind of first aid, you would learn that you never leave a head injured patient alone. And so when we got that report, when the report came into the SO that they had left this guy up there alone, that was a big concern. And so my partner and I flew in the helo. And as we were approaching the peak, we were flying straight in towards, where they had told us we could find him. And we saw this tremendous blood streak going all the way down, hundreds of feet down the peak. And what had happened was that guy the victim had come to at some point, unclipped himself from the anchor that they had him tied in, and fell like 800 feet down the peak.
Oh gosh.
And killed him. So it was a body recovery. It was just poor decisions. And so, having a little bit of preparation goes a long way in maybe saving someone's serious injury or their life. Yeah.
You have seen a lot of death in your time in SAR, and a lot of loss, both to the people around you and people you don't know. I kind of like to dive into this topic of death and grief, and how kind of large of a role it's played in your life. And to me, I think the story that really kind of paints the picture for how serious things can get is the story with Pete. And so, if that's something you're still willing to go into, I'd like to dive into that story and kind of the details around what happened, and ultimately kind of use that story to lay the foundation for dealing with things like that moving forward. So, the story, from what I read, which I found the circumstances of the accident, I found extremely interesting, especially with your kind of role in it, where there's this very ephemeral ice formation forming up very high on the wall. It's going to be an FA. Conditions look great for it. You're planning ahead with a party of 3. And then all of a sudden the conditions start to worsen and the window is shortening and you have to get up on it sooner, which, because of your work, you were unable to participate in the objective, which I found extremely interesting. my first question for this is, what was the job and why was it so important that you bailed on this objective that you were so psyched on?
Yeah. So, yeah, that formation formed up for the first time, and the three of us really started looking at it hard, excuse me, and then the weather changed and started getting warmer, and a storm was inbound, and typically those Pacific storms push a lot of warm air. This was in June Lake, where I lived. I mean, I could see the route from my house, and we had seen this weather coming, and Pete especially kind of threw up the red flag and said, "Man, with the weather changing, this thing could, the root could fall down, and so we need to get on it right away." So we moved up the schedule, and it was like we were having this conversation, and it was going to be the next morning. And I was a builder, and I had a scheduled inspection with the county on one of my projects that I had to be at, and I just, to further the job, I couldn't cancel it. I had to be there for it. So I just told the guys, I said, "Man,